Mist drifts over an old European plain at dawn, glowing pale gold as the first light touches forgotten battlements and silent riverbanks. In this hush, you can almost feel the heartbeat of an empire that once rose with iron determination, an empire forged from fractured kingdoms, steered by calculating statesmen, carried by proud citizens, and ultimately undone by the weight of its own ambitions. This is a story of unity and division, of power gathered slowly like storm clouds on a warm horizon, of discovery, pride, survival, and the quiet resilience of millions whose lives shape the course of history. Step closer and the centuries begin to stir. The clang of distant forges, the murmur of marketplaces, the thunder of armies, and the fragile hope of families waiting behind the lines. As you imagine walking through these changing eras, these wars, reforms, celebrations, and losses, what would you notice first? The rising confidence of a young empire, or the faint tremor of what would one day bring it to its knees? Share your thoughts below and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. If this journey speaks to you, gently tap like and subscribe. It truly helps the story reach others who love history as much as you do. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and step with me into the first moments of the German Empire. In the quiet heart of Central Europe, long before the rise of emperors, countless small realms lay scattered like islands upon an ever-shifting sea. Their borders drifted, their rulers changed, yet their people carried on with quiet purpose beneath the turning seasons. The land that would one day be called Germany was then a tapestry woven from many hands, each thread carrying its own stories, its own hopes, its own steady rhythms of life. If you were to wander across these lands in those early centuries, you would find no single name to unite them. Instead, you would step from duchy to bishopric, from free city to tiny principality, each with its own laws, customs, and gentle peculiarities. One village might speak in a soft, rolling dialect, while the next, only a few miles away, carried a sharper, quicker tone. Some towns welcomed travellers with open laughter and the scent of warm rye bread drifting from their hearths. Others lived quietly behind timbered gates, their people cautious but kind, shaped by long memories of border disputes and shifting allegiances. Yet despite these differences, there was a subtle harmony that echoed across the region, a shared understanding of the land's rhythms. Forests stood ancient and tall, their branches whispering in winds that blew from the North Sea to the foothills of the Alps. Rivers like the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube threaded gracefully through the countryside, linking communities that otherwise felt worlds apart. Along their banks, fishermen cast their nets in calm morning light, while traders guided barges upriver, carrying cloth, grain, and gossip from distant lands. Life, for most, moved at the pace of the seasons. Spring brought soft rains that darkened the soil and filled the fields with the first fragile shoots of barley. Summer hummed with the quiet chorus of insects and the rustle of wheat heavy with promise. Autumn wrapped the villages in a cool golden haze, its days filled with harvest songs and the comforting scent of roasted apples. And winter, gentle or bitter depending on the year, drew families close around their hearths, the crackle of firewood blending with tales passed from one generation to the next. It was a peaceful world, but not without its uncertainties. The greater political structure that bound these lands, the Holy Roman Empire, was vast and complex, more a loose gathering of states than a unified nation. Its emperor held prestige, yet his power varied widely from century to century. Some emperors commanded armies and shaped the course of European history. Others wielded influence only through diplomacy and careful compromise, for the princes, dukes, and city leaders guarded their autonomy fiercely. Still, even amidst this complexity, ordinary life held a quiet steadiness. In the markets, the voices of merchants blended with the rhythmic clack of wagon wheels on cobblestone. Monasteries rose from forest clearings like islands of calm, their gardens filled with herbs and the soft murmur of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight. In small workshops, blacksmiths hammered sparks into the dim air, and weavers shaped wool into warm cloaks to help families endure the winter cold. Some evenings, as the sun slipped slowly behind distant hills, you might imagine hearing the faint toll of a church bell drifting across the fields. Its gentle echo reminded everyone, farmer and noble, merchant and miller, that they were part of something larger, a shared landscape shaped by centuries of tradition. These small threads, carried quietly through time, would one day help bind the fractured realms into a single, powerful empire. But such unity was far from anyone's mind then. Most people lived and died without ever traveling more than a few days' journey from home. The idea of a united German nation was as distant as the stars that shimmered above the rooftops on clear winter nights. Instead, people saw themselves as Bavarians, Saxons, Swabians, Rhinelanders, each identity rooted in its own patch of earth. And perhaps there was comfort in this closeness, in knowing that the world one belonged to was familiar, manageable, shaped by faces one recognized since childhood. Yet even in these quiet years, subtle forces were at work. Trade routes strengthened ties between regions, carrying not only goods, but ideas. Universities rose in cities like Heidelberg and Leipzig, drawing scholars who debated philosophy, science, and the nature of governance. Their thoughts drifted outward like lantern light, touching towns and villages that had long moved to the simple rhythms of tradition. The Reformation added new layers to this evolving landscape. Suddenly, spiritual and political questions intertwined, reshaping loyalties and stirring both conversation and quiet uncertainty. Some communities embraced new teachings with cautious hope, while others clung tightly to the familiar rituals of the past. Through it all, people continued their daily tasks, tending crops, repairing tools, sharing meals, seeking steadiness as the world around them shifted in subtle ways. The centuries passed, and with each change, the land grew a little more connected. Roads improved, making travel safer and more predictable. Postal routes carried letters that linked minds and hearts across distances once difficult to cross. Music, literature, and folk traditions blossomed, creating subtle threads of shared identity even among regions that still viewed each other as distinct. If you walked into a village tavern during these times, you might hear wandering musicians singing ballads that drifted from one region to another. Their songs spoke of love, loss, courage, and the turning of seasons, universal themes that transcended dialects and borders. Some listeners would smile quietly into their cups, while others would close their eyes and let the music soften the weariness of the day. And yet, for all these gentle connections, the mosaic of states remained firmly intact, hundreds of them by some counts. Each had its own ruler, its own coins, its own small pride. No one could yet imagine that within a few generations, these lands would undergo a transformation so profound that the world would speak of a new power rising in Europe. But the foundations were being laid, softly, slowly, like seeds settling into the soil long before the first green shoots appear. By the early 19th century, after the long shadows cast by the Napoleonic Wars, the idea of unity began to stir more clearly. Travellers noticed similarities in customs and language that stretched across regions once thought wholly separate. Merchants recognized that cooperation brought prosperity. Intellectuals wrote of shared heritage, shared struggles, shared hopes. And ordinary people, quiet farmers, artisans and families, felt the effects of every shift, even if they did not yet know the shape that history was taking. Imagine walking through a village at dusk during these transitional years. Lamps glow warmly behind small windows. Children chase each other across the fading light, their laughter echoing softly. A baker pulls one last loaf from the oven, its scent drifting into the cool evening air. These small scenes, so gentle, so human, carried on through centuries of political change. They form the heartbeat of the land, steady and enduring, even as the idea of unity slowly gathered strength beneath the surface. For now, though, the German lands remained a patchwork, beautiful, diverse, and endlessly intricate. A world of many voices, many paths, and many stories. But the currents of history were beginning to shift. In Prussia, ambitions were stirring. In the halls of power, minds like Otto von Bismarck were not yet known, but the conditions that would one day bring such figures to prominence were quietly taking shape. And as the winds of change moved across fields, forests, and riverbanks, the people continued their lives much as they always had. Gentle steps forward, steady breaths beneath the sky, unaware that they stood at the threshold of an era that would transform their world forever. The winds of change that once moved softly across the scattered German realms began to gather with greater purpose, as Prussia, a kingdom once seen as distant and austere, slowly took its place at the centre of history. At first glance, Prussia seemed an unlikely candidate for leadership among the many states of the region. Its lands stretched long and thin, scattered across plains that met the Baltic Sea in cool, rolling waves. Its early rulers were practical rather than flamboyant, their ambitions shaped not by grandeur, but necessity. Yet it was within this quiet persistence that the seeds of future power were planted. To those living in the small Prussian towns and villages of the 17th and 18th centuries, life was as steady and predictable as the turning of the seasons. Wooden houses stood clustered around markets where farmers arrived at dawn, their carts piled with grain, cabbages and bundles of firewood. Church bells marked the passing hours, their chimes drifting across low hills and quiet forests. Most families tended the same fields their ancestors had worked, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of ploughing, sowing and harvesting. But Prussia carried something unusual beneath this calm surface, a deep dedication to discipline, efficiency, and shared purpose. Its rulers believed that order was the foundation upon which all progress could rest. Under the guiding hands of leaders like Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, Prussia strengthened its institutions, refined its administration, and built an army that, though small, was exceptionally well organized. While other states sometimes relied on tradition or ceremony, Prussia embraced structure, clarity, and a quiet but steady determination. Imagine walking through the courtyards of a Prussian garrison town during this time. The sound of boots striking the cobblestone ground echoes in clean, even rhythms. Soldiers drill in coordinated movements, their uniforms simple, but meticulously maintained. Officers speak calmly, their commands shaped by patience as much as authority. There is a sense of mutual understanding here, a belief that discipline does not confine the spirit, but steadies it. Yet beyond the barracks and training fields, the daily life of civilians remained gentle and familiar. Bakers prepared loaves before sunrise, warming village streets with the scent of fresh rye and wheat. Artisans carved wooden toys, tools, and utensils that found their way into homes across the countryside. In the evenings, families gathered around small wooden tables, sharing meals of hearty stews and bread, while stories from distant lands drifted in through travelers who passed along the growing Prussian trade routes. Over time, the kingdom's quiet commitment to structure began to yield remarkable results. Trade expanded, agriculture improved, and towns flourished. Roads became more reliable, linking communities that once felt isolated by distance or seasonal weather. And as Prussia grew, its people developed a sense of shared identity, one rooted not in flamboyant displays of culture, but in hard work, resourcefulness, and resilience. A pivotal transformation arrived under the reign of Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great. Under his guidance, Prussia embraced not only military efficiency, but intellectual curiosity. Frederick welcomed philosophers, musicians, and artists, enriching his court with discussions of reason, governance, and the human spirit. His own love of music drifted warm and soft through palace halls, where the sound of his flute blended with the gentle rustle of tapestries and the glow of candlelight. Still, even as culture blossomed, Frederick's leadership ensured Prussia's strength continued to grow. His reforms modernized agriculture and justice, creating a more stable, predictable world for ordinary people. And though conflicts inevitably touched the kingdom, the stories that filtered down to the villagers often carried softened edges, whispers of distant battles, while life at home continued its steady course. Children played in farmyards, chasing each other past fences woven from willow branches. Shepherds guided flocks across quiet meadows, listening to the soft bleating of sheep mixing with the sigh of the wind. Markets bustled with chatter, as merchants from distant cities brought spices, cloth, and tales of lands most villagers would only ever know through conversation. In these everyday moments, the future of Prussia, strong, cohesive, and quietly determined, was quietly taking shape. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the landscape of Central Europe began to shift once again. The Napoleonic Wars swept across the region, stirring uncertainty and prompting deep reflection. Prussia, struck by early defeats, found itself at a crossroads. But rather than fall into despair, the kingdom responded with humility and renewed purpose. Leaders and citizens alike recognized that change was necessary, and so began one of the most profound periods of reform in Prussian history. Imagine the atmosphere of those years, a mixture of challenge and hope. Schoolmasters introduced new forms of education, encouraging curiosity and critical thought. Officers restructured military training to emphasize unity over rigid hierarchy. Farmers experimented with new techniques that improved harvests and strengthened rural communities. Across Prussia, people sensed that they were part of something evolving, something that honored tradition, but also looked carefully to the future. These reforms, grounded in practicality and compassion, transformed Prussia from a regional power into a model of resilience. When the tides of conflict finally receded, the kingdom emerged not weakened but strengthened, respected for its discipline and determination. And this transformation rippled through the German lands, where people began to look toward Prussia with a new curiosity. Perhaps, they wondered, this was a place where unity could take root, a kingdom that combined structure with vision, tradition with thoughtful progress. Still, life for ordinary people remained gentle in its rhythms. Even as political ideas stirred in universities and parliaments, villagers continued to tend fields, craft goods, and gather for festivals beneath fluttering banners. Children learned their letters from chalkboards, their eyes bright with possibility. Travellers shared warm meals in coach houses where fires crackled softly against the winter cold. And across the countryside, the seasons continued their steady dance. Spring blossoms, summer warmth, autumn harvests, winter quiet. By the mid-19th century, the idea of German unity, once faint and distant, began to gain clearer shape. The people sensed it in small but meaningful ways. Shared songs sung by travellers, similar customs celebrated across distant regions, and a growing awareness that they belonged to a larger story. But unity would require guidance, diplomacy, and a firm understanding of the delicate balance between ambition and cooperation. In Prussia, the groundwork had been laid. A strong administrative system, a capable army, and a population united by discipline and quiet pride formed the foundation upon which future leaders could build. Among these future leaders stood a man little known to the villagers at the time, but destined to reshape the course of history, Otto von Bismarck. But for now, in this moment of gentle transition, Prussia stood as a kingdom prepared for change, but not yet certain of its path. The fields still stretched calm beneath the afternoon sun. River mist drifted over quiet valleys, and the people, hard-working, hopeful, and steady, continued their daily lives, unaware that the currents gathering beneath their feet would soon reshape the German world. As evening settled across the land, fires glowed warmly behind shuttered windows, and the wind carried distant whispers of change, soft, steady, and full of possibility. The path to unification was beginning to form, and Prussia, with its quiet strength and steadfast spirit, was gently stepping forward into its place in the unfolding story. As Prussia stepped quietly into a new century, its people continued their calm routines, unaware that a figure had already begun to take shape in the background of history, someone whose mind moved like a slow, deliberate current beneath seemingly still waters. Otto von Bismarck, born into a family of rural landowners, did not arrive on the political stage with fireworks or fanfare. Instead, he entered public life the way clouds gather along a distant horizon, gradually, almost softly, until their presence becomes undeniable. Bismarck's early years carried the texture of country life. Imagine him walking the fields of the family estate in Pomerania, where gentle winds brushed across tall grasses, and the air carried the mild scent of earth after rain. He grew up surrounded by quiet landscapes, the steady rhythms of farm work, and the subtle interplay between privilege and responsibility. These environments shaped him, not into a dreamer, but into someone who observed carefully, listened deeply, and weighed possibilities before acting. Those who met him in his youth sometimes struggled to predict his path. He was intelligent, certainly, but not the type who sought academic glory. He preferred conversation to lectures, debate to rote learning, and the living world to the confines of a study hall. Yet beneath his calm exterior lay a sharp mind that noticed the small details others overlooked. The quiet shifts in opinion, the tensions beneath polite gestures, the opportunities hidden in moments of uncertainty. When Bismarck entered Prussian politics, he did so with a sense of curiosity rather than ambition. The Prussian parliament of the mid-19th century was a place of lively discussion, where ideas of unity, reform, and tradition intertwined in gentle but persistent debate. The atmosphere was often polite, sometimes tense, but always shaped by the careful manner of Prussian officials. Bismarck listened more than he spoke at first, absorbing the rhythms of the chamber, the personalities of its members, and the subtle currents of influence that guided its decisions. His early speeches were striking not because they were loud or fiery, but because they were clear and grounded. He spoke with a calm conviction that suggested he had considered every angle before opening his mouth. When he criticized a policy, he did so with precise logic. When he defended a position, he rooted his arguments in the tangible realities of governance. His words often carried the firmness of iron, but were wrapped in the manners of a diplomat. People began to notice him, not with awe or fear, but with quiet respect. Respect for someone who seemed to possess both clarity of purpose and the patience to wait for the right moment. As political debates in Prussia grew more complex, particularly about the future of the German lands, Bismarck's voice gained weight. Yet he was not guided by ideology alone. He was guided by practicality, by an understanding that nations were not shaped by grand gestures alone, but by careful steps, thoughtful decisions, and the artful balancing of competing interests. Beyond the halls of government, life continued peacefully for the Prussian people. Markets bustled gently at midday. Children learned arithmetic and handwriting in neatly kept village schools. Carriages rolled slowly over cobblestone streets, their wheels clattering in rhythmic patterns that mingled with birdsong drifting from nearby trees. While political changes brewed quietly in Berlin, most citizens lived day to day, focused on their homes, their work, and the turning of the seasons. Yet even they felt the subtle effects of transformation. New railways stretched across the countryside, their iron tracks shimmering in morning light. They linked towns that once seemed far apart, carrying passengers who marveled at traveling faster than horses could carry them. These gentle shifts in connection and mobility laid the groundwork for something greater, a sense that the many German states might share more than they once believed. Bismarck understood this. He saw the potential for unity not as an abstract dream, but as a slow-building tide. He recognized that Prussia's strength, its disciplined administration, its structured military, its growing economy, placed it in a unique position to guide this tide. But he also knew that rushing the process could bring instability. Unity, he believed, must be shaped with care, like a craftsman smoothing wood grain until the surface is strong and even. As he grew in political responsibility, his diplomatic instincts sharpened. He formed relationships across Europe's courts, observing how neighbouring powers shifted their alliances and expressed their concerns. France watched the German lands with cautious curiosity. Austria, long influential within the Holy Roman Empire's former boundaries, guarded its prestige carefully. Russia, expansive and unpredictable, influenced the region's northern and eastern borders. Bismarck studied them all, not to provoke conflict, but to understand how Prussia could navigate a world filled with delicate balances. It was during this time that he developed a philosophy that would guide his future decisions. Power, he believed, rested not only in armies or treaties, but in timing. A nation must act neither too early nor too late. It must speak when its voice will carry weight and remain silent when listening will yield greater advantage. This approach made Bismarck not just a statesman, but a strategist of remarkable patience. Back in the countryside, life continued with its reassuring quietness. Fields blossomed in spring with pale green shoots, and summer brought warm breezes that rippled through meadows like waves. In towns, artisans shaped wood, iron, and cloth into objects both practical and beautiful. Families gathered on cool evenings to share stories by lamplight, unaware that in the government offices of Berlin, a new vision for their homeland was beginning to take form. When Bismarck eventually became Minister-President of Prussia, he did not stride into power with dramatic declarations. Instead, he approached his role with the same calm calculation that had defined his earlier years. He strengthened Prussia's governmental structures, improved communication between military and civilian officials, and encouraged policies that promoted economic growth. His approach was not always easy for his contemporaries to understand, but his results slowly earned their trust. He believed that Prussia, and indeed all German lands, needed a sense of unity built not on sentiment alone, but on stability. To achieve this, he would employ a blend of firm resolve and careful diplomacy. Some would later call this approach realpolitik, a term meant to capture the realism and practicality with which he viewed the world. Imagine Bismarck in his study during these years. Papers lie neatly arranged on his desk, ink glistening softly in the lamplight. Outside the window, the faint sound of carriage wheels drifts along the quiet street. He pauses in his writing, contemplating the fragile balance of power in Europe and the hopes of the people who would one day call a united Germany their home. There is no hurry in his movements, only steadiness, thoughtfulness, and the quiet certainty that the path to unity, though complex, can be shaped one careful step at a time. And so, with each year that passed, Bismarck wove together threads of diplomacy, strategy, and vision. His early calculations, subtle, patient, and grounded, became the foundation for the transformations that would soon follow. The soft winds moving across Prussia now carried the first hints of a profound shift, a change that would ripple through cities, villages, and farmlands alike. The German lands, long scattered and varied, stood on the threshold of something new. And Bismarck, steady as iron yet gentle in his precision, quietly prepared to guide them into an era that would reshape their world. The quiet foundations laid by Prussia's reforms and Bismarck's patient calculations soon began to shape the world in ways that ordinary people could feel, even if they did not yet understand the full meaning of the change. The winds that once whispered softly through peaceful fields now carried the faint stirrings of tension, an uneasy shifting in the air as long-standing rivalries and delicate alliances began to settle into new patterns. And though life continued with familiar rhythms, a sense of anticipation drifted through the German lands, subtle as the first cool breath of autumn after a long summer. Bismarck, ever attentive to timing, saw that the moment for unity was approaching. But he also recognized that the path would not be walked through grand speeches or symbolic gestures alone. The German states, diverse, independent, protective of their traditions, would not simply join together because the idea was appealing. Something stronger was needed, something that could bind them with a sense of shared purpose. The wars of unification, as history would later call them, did not begin with the spirit of conquest, but with the quiet calculation of necessity. Bismarck understood that certain conflicts, if approached carefully, could shape alliances rather than shatter them. He often saw political movement the way a farmer might watch the sky, observing clouds, feeling the wind, and determining when a distant storm might bring nourishment instead of harm. The first of these conflicts, the Danish War of 1864, began not with the roar of armies, but with a question of borders and identity. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, resting between Denmark and the German states, carried histories that intertwined both cultures. For generations, their people tended fields, fished along quiet coasts, and spoke in dialects shaped by both German and Danish influences. Yet questions of governance lingered, creating uncertainty for those who called the duchies home. When Denmark moved to tighten control over these borderlands, Bismarck sensed an opportunity, not for domination, but for cooperation. He knew that Austria, though often Prussia's rival, shared an interest in protecting the German-speaking communities in the region. And so, with careful diplomacy and the steady patience that defined his character, he shaped a temporary alliance. Imagine the people of Schleswig waking before sunrise during those tense months. The morning light spread softly across the flat northern landscape, touching thatched roofs and quiet harbours. Fishermen prepare their boats as they always have, hands steady even as rumours drift from town to town. Some wonder what the future will bring. Others trust that life, like the tide, will continue to ebb and flow in familiar ways. The war itself, though brief and contained, changed the course of German politics. Prussia and Austria succeeded together, but their victory carried the seeds of a deeper conflict. Once the duchies were secured, disagreements arose over how they should be governed. Bismarck, watching carefully, recognized that the partnership had served its purpose. Now, the path forward required clarity, a decisive step that would determine whether Prussia or Austria would guide the future of the German lands. Yet even as political tensions rose, everyday life continued with gentle steadiness throughout much of Germany. In Bavaria, village musicians gathered in open squares, filling the warm evening air with soft melodies. In Saxony, craftsmen shaped porcelain, their hands moving with practiced grace. In the Rhineland, vineyards stretched along riversides, their leaves shimmering beneath the late afternoon sun. People lived their lives unaware that the framework of their shared identity was being quietly reshaped in diplomatic offices and ministerial chambers. The next step in Bismarck's careful plan emerged through the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, sometimes called the 7 Weeks' War. Though the name suggests haste, the preparation behind it had unfolded slowly, patiently. Bismarck understood that Prussia's vision for unity required leadership that Austria could not share. The old structure of authority, rooted in centuries of tradition, had grown too rigid for the changing world. Prussia, with its reforms and rising confidence, was better positioned to guide the German states through the uncertainties of the modern age. Still, for most citizens, the conflict arrived like a distant echo. They heard news through letters, travellers, and gently whispered conversations in markets. Soldiers marched with disciplined steps along roads where children once played, their uniforms brushing softly against summer breezes. Villagers offered food and water, their gestures quiet but heartfelt, aware that the young men passing through carried the hopes of a nation in transition. The war, though intense in its decision-making, was swift on the battlefield. Prussia's disciplined army, guided by efficient planning and the advantages of modern rail transport, moved with remarkable coordination. Austria, despite its bravery and long military tradition, struggled to keep pace in a world that was shifting toward new systems and technologies. And so, the conflict concluded quickly, its results shaping the future with surprising gentleness. When the peace settlement was reached, Bismarck insisted on moderation. He did not seek to crush Austria or humiliate its people. Instead, he sought stability, a reassurance that Austria would remain a respected neighbour, even as Prussia stepped forward as leader of the newly formed North German Confederation. This act of restraint, rare in the politics of the time, ensured that wounds did not fester and that future cooperation remained possible. Across the German states, life resumed its familiar rhythms. Blacksmiths returned to their forges, the hiss of hot iron blending with the steady beat of hammers. Farmers harvested crops beneath golden sunlight, the scent of cut hay drifting through warm air. Children once again played beside streams and under shaded trees, their laughter carrying into quiet evenings. Though borders and alliances had shifted, the essence of daily life remained peaceful and enduring. Yet unity was not complete. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others, remained independent, their traditions deeply rooted and their loyalties divided between old relationships and new possibilities. Bismarck, recognizing their caution, did not seek to force their hand. Instead, he waited, watched, and allowed time to create the circumstances that might gently guide them toward unity. Those circumstances emerged with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. France, concerned by Prussia's growing influence, sought to assert its dominance. But Bismarck, ever alert to shifts in the political winds, understood that France's posture would change the perspectives of the southern states. When conflict erupted, they found themselves drawn naturally into alliance with the North German Confederation. They shared language, culture, and destiny, and now a common cause. As the war unfolded, news travelled through German towns, not with panic, but with a sense of quiet determination. People lit candles in their windows, prayed for the safety of their loved ones, and hoped that resolution would come swiftly. And when the conflict ended with Prussia's victory, a profound transformation settled upon the German lands. On a winter morning in 1871, within the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed. It was not the empire of old legends or grand ancient kings, but a modern unity born from diplomacy, resilience, and the hope for shared identity. The people of Germany, long scattered across countless principalities, now belong to something greater, a nation shaped not by haste, but by the careful aligning of countless small threads. Yet even then, for the villagers and townsfolk across the land, life continued with gentle familiarity. Snow fell softly over rooftops. Fires crackled in hearths. Families gathered to share warm meals, unaware that their world had changed forever. And so, through conflict carefully guided and diplomacy patiently woven, the German Empire entered the world, an empire forged not in cruelty, but in calculated necessity and a quiet yearning for unity. The winter morning that marked the birth of the German Empire carried a stillness that seemed almost ceremonial in itself. Snow rested in soft drifts along the roads leading to Versailles, muffling footsteps and quieting the world beneath a pale, muted sky. Inside the palace, lamps flickered gently against the cool marble floors and shimmering gilded surfaces, casting warm light that danced in the countless mirrors lining the grand hall. It was here, in a place once associated with the height of French royal power, that a new chapter in European history unfolded, not with thunder, but with the steady, deliberate breath of inevitability. Those present in the Hall of Mirrors that January morning of 1871 felt a peculiar mix of emotion: pride, solemnity, fatigue from the long months of war, and an awareness that they stood at the threshold of something vast and untested. Officers and dignitaries gathered in quiet clusters, their uniforms bearing traces of winter travel, their eyes lifted often to the high arched ceiling where painted figures seemed to watch over the ceremony. The air was thick with the faint scent of wax, polished wood, and the cold that had swept in with their cloaks. At the heart of this gathering stood King Wilhelm I of Prussia, a man who had never sought the grandeur of empire. His nature was steady, grounded in a sense of duty rather than personal ambition. Even on this momentous day, he appeared much as he always did: calm, dignified, thoughtful. There was no triumphant flourish in his posture, no boastful declaration in his expression. Instead, he held the quiet awareness that the title he was about to accept came not from desire, but from the tides of history that had carried him forward. Bismarck stood nearby, his presence firm yet unobtrusive. He had guided the path to this moment with patience and precision, stitching together alliances, navigating rivalries, and ensuring that each step toward unity was rooted in stability. Yet he too remained solemn. He understood deeply that an empire was not simply proclaimed. It had to be nurtured, supported by the hopes and labours of millions who would never stand inside these glittering halls. His eyes moved slowly across the assembled faces, as if measuring not the grandeur of the moment, but the responsibilities it carried. When the proclamation was read, voices echoing gently through the long reflective space, the words seemed to linger in the air like a warm breath upon glass. Wilhelm was declared German Emperor, and the assembled princes, generals, and officials offered their salutes. The sound rose, then faded, absorbed by the mirrors that lined the walls. No grand bells tolled outside, no cannons thundered. Instead, the moment felt intimate, shaped by the quiet dignity of those who witnessed it. Far beyond the palace, across the German lands, news of the empire's birth travelled slowly at first. It arrived in handwritten letters, carried by cold-fingered messengers, in newspapers printed with ink still glistening, and in whispered accounts shared between travellers seeking warm coffee in winter inns. Some villagers heard the news while tending livestock, the frost still clinging to wooden fences. Others learned of it while gathering firewood in forest clearings where the silence of snow softened the world. Their reactions varied: curiosity, hope, caution, but all felt the gentle ripple of change. Yet despite the magnitude of the event, life continued in its familiar rhythms. In small towns, children practiced their lessons beside classroom stoves, their breath fogging the air each time the teacher opened the door to shake out her boots. Bakers kneaded dough at dawn, letting the warmth of their ovens push back the winter chill. In city streets, vendors sold roasted chestnuts, their carts glowing softly in the dimming afternoon light. Though a new empire had been born, the world did not transform overnight. Instead, it expanded gently, giving people time to adjust to the idea of belonging to something larger than their province, their dialect, or their long-held traditions. The new empire united kingdoms, duchies, and cities that had once guarded their independence carefully. Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, and others joined with Prussia, each bringing their own customs, their own histories, their own quiet pride. This unity did not erase their individuality. Rather, it created a patchwork woven more tightly than before, held together by shared institutions, shared aspirations, and the hope for a peaceful, prosperous future. Within the first months of the empire, a soft sense of optimism drifted across the land. New railway lines were proposed to strengthen connections between distant regions. Scholars imagined universities working together to advance knowledge. Farmers envisioned steadier markets, while merchants anticipated greater cooperation in trade. Even the architecture of small towns began to reflect a subtle shift. New administrative buildings, post offices, and rail stations rose with designs that suggested a growing sense of national character. Yet the empire's formation also brought quiet challenges. How would the diverse peoples of these lands balance regional identities with a collective one? How could traditions be preserved while new systems took shape? Such questions did not demand immediate answers, but they lingered like distant bells, tolling softly through winter fog. Bismarck, ever attuned to these delicate matters, worked with the same careful touch that had guided his earlier endeavours. He crafted new policies, adjusted old ones, and sought ways for the empire to stand strong without overreaching. His guiding principle remained clear: stability first, ambition second. He believed that the unity achieved in the Hall of Mirrors must be nurtured through patience, cooperation, and attentiveness to the needs of ordinary people. And ordinary people felt the effects in small, gradual ways. A farmer receiving standardized currency found his trade simpler. A traveller boarding a train between distant cities felt a new sense of ease. Families reading newspapers noticed that stories from different regions now felt interconnected, woven into a shared narrative. These small threads strengthened the fabric of the empire, not through force, but through familiarity. As spring approached in that first year of unity, the German countryside stirred gently from winter's quiet. Snow melted into streams that fed fields of barley and rye. Trees budded with fresh life, and birds returned, their songs drifting across the newly awakened landscape. Families opened their shutters to let in the soft light, sweeping out the dust of winter and preparing for markets, festivals, and journeys. In many ways, the birth of the German Empire mirrored the arrival of the spring. Not a sudden transformation, but a gradual unfolding. A quiet assurance that something new was growing, something that might offer strength and stability for generations to come. And though the palace at Versailles had been the setting for its proclamation, the true heart of the empire lay not in gilded halls, but in the daily lives of its people. In the baker's warm hearth, the farmer's steady gait, the child's laughter echoing down cobblestone streets, and the trader's hopeful glance toward the horizon. For unity, after all, is not merely a political act. It is a feeling, a shared breath, a gentle weaving together of countless ordinary moments. And as the German Empire took its first steps into the world, it carried with it the quiet dreams, the steady labour, and the soft resilience of millions who called those lands home. In the years that followed the proclamation of the German Empire, the lands that now shared a common banner began to settle into a new rhythm, one shaped not by abrupt change, but by the soft interweaving of old traditions and subtle modern currents. The empire, though young, carried within it centuries of history, craftsmanship, and regional pride. And as the 1870s unfolded gently across its fields, towns, and riverbanks, life took on a shape that felt both familiar and quietly transformed. For many families, the first noticeable shift was not political, but practical. New postal routes brought letters more swiftly, creating threads of communication between regions that once felt distant. Newspapers delivered stories of inventions, discoveries, and debates that touched every corner of the empire. A farmer in Württemberg could read about the opening of a railway station in Hamburg. A teacher in East Prussia might learn of cultural festivals in Bavaria. These small glimpses of one another's worlds created a subtle sense of shared identity, soft, like a melody carried on a light breeze. The cities of the empire, especially Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, grew steadily during these years. Industry hummed quietly in their outskirts, where factories with tall, slender chimneys exhaled thin plumes of smoke into the sky. Yet the growth did not feel overwhelming. Instead, it rose slowly, like a tide that gently reshapes the shoreline. Workers walked to their jobs as the morning sun brushed rooftops with warm amber light. Street vendors set up carts filled with warm pastries, apples, and carved wooden toys. In quieter neighbourhoods, chestnut trees rustled softly above cobblestone paths, their leaves casting dappled shadows on the ground below. Inside many factories, machines clicked and whirred with measured precision. The industrial age had begun to take root across Europe, and Germany embraced it with a sense of methodical purpose. Yet even here, in these new centres of labour, a certain calmness prevailed. Workers knew the rhythms of the machines as intimately as farmers knew the rhythms of the soil. Breaks were taken at regular hours, meals shared over simple wooden benches, conversations drifting between laughter, hopes, and gentle complaints. The air carried the faint scent of oil, metal, and wool, an aroma of progress that blended with the more familiar sense of the surrounding countryside. But the empire was not only factories and bustling cities. Much of Germany remained rural, dotted with villages that seemed gently untouched by the swift march of industrial growth. In these places, life continued according to the pace of the seasons. Spring brought lambs to the pastures and renewed energy to households emerging from winter's quiet. Summer filled the air with the hum of bees and the rustle of wheat fields swaying beneath soft breezes. Autumn painted the hillsides in amber and gold, fruit trees bending under the weight of apples and plums. And winter, with its crisp stillness, drew families close around stoves and hearths, where stories, songs, and warm meals offered comfort against the cold. These rural communities carried deep traditions, festivals marking the harvest, dances held in village squares, and quiet gatherings where musicians played violins and accordions beneath lantern light. Weddings brought neighbours together in celebrations that lasted late into the night, filled with shared meals, gentle laughter, and the soft rhythms of well-loved folk melodies. Even funerals, though solemn, were held with a sense of communal closeness, offering reassurance in times of sorrow. Education, too, expanded under the new empire. Village schools, often housed in simple wooden buildings, grew more organized. Teachers emphasized reading, writing, arithmetic, and a growing awareness of the wider world. Children sat at long wooden desks, dipping their pens into inkpots and practicing their letters with patient precision. Some walked miles each morning, their breath turning to mist in the early air, their lunch wrapped in cloth, carried carefully in their small hands. And while the lessons sometimes felt demanding, there was pride in learning, an understanding that knowledge opened doors to new possibilities. In larger towns, universities flourished. Students from across the empire gathered to study philosophy, science, medicine, and engineering. Lecture halls echoed with the gentle buzz of discussion, while libraries offered shelves upon shelves of books that smelled faintly of leather and ink. Many ideas that would shape Europe's future found their beginnings in these calm, contemplative spaces where scholars worked late into the night, their lamps casting soft circles of light. Amid these changes, Kaiser Wilhelm I held a symbolic place in the hearts of many citizens. He was not distant, despite his position. His demeanour, steadfast, measured, and kindly, reflected the values many Germans admired. People read about his travels, his meetings with officials, and his dedication to maintaining peace within the realm. They spoke of him not with fear, but with a gentle respect, as one might speak of an elder whose presence offers reassurance. Social life in the empire blossomed during these years. Cafes became popular gathering places where friends and strangers alike shared warm coffee and slices of cake while discussing art, music, and politics. In cities, orchestras performed symphonies that filled concert halls with rich, enveloping sound. The works of composers like Brahms, Wagner, and Strauss drifted through open windows on warm summer evenings, creating a sense of cultural richness that deepened the nation's emerging identity. In households across the empire, family life carried its own quiet joys. Mothers sewed clothes by lamplight, their stitches small and precise. Fathers repaired tools in sheds that smelled of sawdust and iron. Children played games in courtyards, their laughter echoing between brick walls. Meals were often simple, stews, breads, vegetables from the garden, but shared with gratitude and warmth. New technologies continued to find their way into these homes, though gently rather than abruptly. Some families purchased sewing machines, their pedals clicking steadily as they worked. Others hung small framed photographs on their walls, delicate images captured by the recently popular art of photography. These changes blended seamlessly with older customs, creating homes that felt both timeless and quietly modern. Transportation also evolved, bringing regions closer than ever. Trains became a familiar sight across the empire, their engines sighing softly as they pulled into stations where travellers waited with carpeted bags and hopeful expressions. Inside the carriages, passengers sat by windows, watching forests, rivers, and rolling hills pass by in soothing rhythms. They exchanged stories, shared sandwiches wrapped in paper, and marvelled at how swiftly the countryside moved beneath them. Yet for all these developments, the core of German life remained rooted in a sense of community. Neighbors helped one another with harvests, shared tools, watched children when a parent was ill, and offered warm loaves of bread to new families in town. Even in growing cities, local districts form their own small worlds where people recognize familiar faces and greeted each other kindly in the morning light. The empire of these early years was not defined solely by its politics or its expanding industries, but by the gentle, steady pulse of everyday life. A pulse felt in workshops, kitchens, fields, and quiet streets. This was the world that grew beneath the Kaiser's watch, a realm shaped by hope, ambition, and the simple joys that made each day meaningful. But while the empire thrived in many ways, the currents of change never truly stilled. New ideas, new challenges, and new ambitions moved quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. And as the 19th century neared its final decades, the careful balance that had defined the early empire would soon begin to shift once more. For now, though, the people of Germany lived in a world that felt expansive and full of promise, a place where old traditions found harmony with modern aspirations, and where the gentle hum of daily life carried the soft rhythm of a nation finding its place in history. As the 1870s gave way to the quieter glow of the 1880s, the German Empire, still young but growing in confidence, settled into a rhythm shaped by the steady hands of its leaders. At the center of this delicate balance stood Otto von Bismarck, now the empire's first chancellor. While the Kaiser embodied continuity and stability, Bismarck operated like the quiet steward of a great machine, adjusting gears, smoothing friction, and ensuring that each part moved in harmony with the others. The empire's people rarely saw him in person, yet they felt the effects of his decisions in ways both subtle and profound. A teacher in a small schoolhouse might notice new expectations in her curriculum. A factory worker might find that new protections softened the hardships of illness or injury. A farmer might hear from a travelling merchant about new agreements with foreign lands. Agreements meant to shield the empire from uncertainty. All these changes, though varied, emerged from the same careful source: Bismarck's belief that unity must be nurtured if it was to endure. He understood that a nation as diverse as Germany could not remain stable through strength alone. It required trust between regions, between social classes, and between the government and its people. And so, he approached governance as he had approached unification, with patience, strategy, and an unwavering focus on balance. One of Bismarck's earliest challenges was the delicate relationship between the empire and the Catholic Church, a relationship known as the Kulturkampf. The Catholic population, particularly strong in southern and western regions, viewed their faith as a guiding force in daily life. Parish bells marked the hours, priests offered counsel in moments of joy and sorrow, and church festivals shaped the rhythm of the year. Bismarck respected these traditions, yet he also believed that the new empire needed clear boundaries between religious authority and state governance. Yet even this conflict, which might have divided a lesser nation, unfolded with surprising restraint. While new policies created tension, the people carried on with their daily rhythms, farmers tending fields, artisans shaping their crafts, children walking to school as morning frost sparkled on rooftops. Eventually, Bismarck recognized that harmony mattered more than victory. His gradual easing of the Kulturkampf helped restore a sense of calm, reminding the empire that unity was strongest when it made space for diversity. While these domestic matters shaped the inner life of the empire, Bismarck also turned his attention outward. Europe, with its shifting alliances and long memories, was a map of delicate relationships. And Bismarck, with his keen understanding of balance, sought to ensure that the German Empire remained secure without provoking unnecessary fear from its neighbours. Imagine him at work during these years, late evenings in a lamplit study, the room quiet except for the soft rustle of papers and the ticking of a clock, maps spread across the table, letters from diplomats neatly stacked beside them. He traced borders not as dividing lines, but as points of connection, each requiring careful attention. He crafted alliances with Austria and Russia, agreements meant to keep the peace and assure Europe that Germany sought stability, not expansion. These alliances acted like soft threads holding the continent in a loose but reassuring network. For the people of Germany, they meant quieter nights, steadier trade, and the comforting sense that diplomacy guided their nation's path more often than conflict. Yet perhaps Bismarck's most lasting contributions were found not in foreign policy, but in the social reforms he introduced at home. He understood that unity could not flourish if workers felt forgotten or unprotected. The growing factories of the empire, while symbols of progress, brought risks, injuries, illness, and the uncertainties of industrial life. And so, with a perspective far ahead of many of his time, Bismarck introduced pioneering social protections. Health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions made their way into the fabric of German society. In small towns and bustling cities alike, families felt a quiet shift. A mother whose husband fell ill no longer faced despair alone. A worker injured on the job could find support rather than ruin. An elderly man, after decades of labour, could greet the twilight years of his life with greater dignity and less fear. These reforms did not remove all hardship, but they softened its edges. They brought a sense of care and reassurance, a reminder that the empire was not merely a political structure, but a community of millions bound by shared fate. Daily life reflected this growing stability. In Berlin, cafes buzzed with soft conversation as scholars debated new ideas, and musicians performed gentle melodies that drifted into the evening air. Trolley cars rumbled through the streets, their bells chiming softly as passengers stepped on and off. In quieter provinces, families gathered after long workdays to share meals seasoned with herbs from their gardens, discussing local news and stories carried by travelling merchants. Children grew up in a world where opportunity felt more reachable than ever before. Some dreamed of becoming engineers, inspired by the locomotives they saw gliding along steel rails. Others imagined becoming doctors, teachers, or musicians. In schoolrooms warmed by coal stoves, they learned not only arithmetic and writing, but also a sense of belonging to a wider whole, an empire that, though vast, still felt familiar. The countryside, too, experienced gentle transformation. New tools and techniques improved harvests, and rural markets hummed with fresh energy. Farmers who once travelled only to nearby towns now found themselves visiting larger cities, marvelling at electric lights that glowed like tiny suns in the night. Yet even with modern touches, the land retained its ancient rhythms. Wheat ripened beneath blue summer skies. Rivers glimmered in early morning light. Church bells continued to call communities together, their tones unchanged by the passing decades. For Bismarck, these years were both rewarding and challenging. He maintained balance with the care of a gardener tending a delicate tree. trimming here, supporting there, ensuring that each branch grew in harmony with the others. But he also understood that no gardener could tend forever. New voices emerged in politics, new questions filled public discussion, and the empire itself began to imagine roles beyond what Bismarck believed wise. Yet during his long tenure, he ensured something precious: peace. Under his guidance, Germany did not seek unnecessary conflict. Its strength lay not in conquest, but in stability. And the people felt the security he cultivated, whether they lived in the quiet fields of Mecklenburg, the bustling streets of Hamburg, or the rolling hills of Bavaria. By the late 1880s, however, the era of Bismarck's dominance was nearing its end. A new generation was rising, one with fresh ambitions, fresh uncertainties, and a vision of Germany that differed from the cautious balance he had so carefully built. Change was coming, softly at first, like the distant rumble of a summer storm far beyond the horizon. But for now, in this moment of reflection, the empire rested in a calm shaped by Bismarck's steady hands. A calm where families felt secure, workers felt supported, and the nation breathed in quiet unity. When Kaiser Wilhelm I passed from the world, a soft hush seemed to settle across the empire he had helped shepherd into being. People paused in their daily routines, farmers leaning on fence posts, factory workers stepping away from their machines, children tugging gently at their parents' sleeves, aware that an era of steadiness had quietly come to an end. Wilhelm I had been a reassuring presence, a figure whose calmness felt as dependable as the turning of the seasons. His absence left the empire standing on the threshold of something new, its direction now resting in younger hands. His successor, Kaiser Friedrich III, ruled only briefly before illness carried him away, leaving the throne to his son, Wilhelm II, a man whose energy and ambitions differed sharply from the measured, deliberate approach of the elder generation. When Wilhelm II stepped into the role of emperor in 1888, the atmosphere of Germany began to shift, almost like a sudden change in the wind before a summer storm, noticeable but not yet fully understood. Wilhelm II was not unkind nor careless. He simply saw the world differently than Bismarck or his grandfather had. Where they valued caution and patient diplomacy, he saw opportunity and movement. Where they worked to maintain quiet balance, he envisioned dramatic growth. His mind raced with images of ships gliding across distant oceans, factories humming with innovation, and Germany stepping confidently onto the world stage as a modern, vibrant power. To the people of Germany, these changes appeared gradually, like ripples spreading across a still pond. In Berlin, citizens noticed more frequent public appearances by their young emperor, processions with polished carriages, glistening uniforms, and spirited speeches delivered beneath fluttering flags. Wilhelm's presence filled the city with an air of excitement, though some found the sudden energy a little overwhelming. Others admired it, sensing a youthful vigor that promised new possibilities. One of Wilhelm's strongest passions was the navy. He dreamed of ships grand enough to rival those of Britain, their hulls cutting steadily through open seas under the German flag. In ports along the North Sea, shipbuilders began to receive new contracts. Workers hammered steel plates into place while sparks flickered gently in the dim light. The scent of salt water mingled with the warm tang of hot metal. People gathered along the docks to watch construction begin. Men, women, and curious children peering at the rising frames that would one day become great vessels. This naval expansion captured imaginations across the empire. Newspapers printed illustrations of sleek battleships, their towering masts and powerful engines, symbols of Germany's growing industrial might. In schoolrooms, teachers spoke of modern engineering and the marvels of technology. Yet while excitement spread, so too did quiet questions. Would these ambitions bring admiration or unease from other nations? Would Germany's growing confidence shift the balance Bismarck had worked so carefully to maintain? Bismarck himself, now aging but still sharp, watched these developments with increasing concern. He respected Wilhelm II, but sensed that the emperor's restless energy might carry Germany into uncertain waters. For years, Bismarck had served as the anchor that kept the empire steady, guiding its course with caution. But Wilhelm wanted room to shape the future on his own terms. The tension between them grew gently at first, then more noticeably. In government buildings where conversations once flowed smoothly, whispers now drifted through the hallways like faint drafts of wind. Officials sensed a change coming. And in 1890, that change arrived. Bismarck resigned from office. His departure marked the true turning point of the era, not with fanfare, but with the soft closing of a door. Across Germany, people reflected on all he had done. Farmers remembered how his reforms had brought stability. Workers recalled the protections he had helped establish. Many felt gratitude, mixed with the quiet worry that comes when a trusted guide steps aside. Wilhelm II, eager to shape his own legacy, moved forward with confidence. He spoke often of progress, of industry, of Germany's destiny as a leading world power. Cities began to reflect this vision. In Berlin, new boulevards widened beneath rows of lamps that glowed like warm stars in the evening mist. Electric trams hummed along tracks where horse-drawn carriages once made their slow journeys. Factories expanded, their tall windows casting bright rectangles of light onto the streets long after sunset. In the countryside, people watched these changes with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Life remained steady in the villages, children chasing each other through orchards, shepherds guiding flocks across rolling fields, families gathering beneath grapevines heavy with summer fruit. But newspapers, travelling merchants, and visitors returning from the cities carried stories that felt almost unreal. Machines capable of lifting heavy loads with ease, laboratories full of discoveries, grand exhibitions celebrating German innovation. Some evenings, in farmhouses warmed by gently crackling stoves, families pondered these tales. What would such progress mean for the quiet rhythms they cherished? Would their children stay to work the land or seek new futures in bustling cities? The questions hung softly in the air, unanswered, but not unwelcome. Change, after all, has a way of arriving whether one is ready or not. Across Europe, other nations also noticed Germany's growing confidence. Some admired its achievements, its scientific advances, its industrious spirit. Others felt uneasy, sensing that the continent's delicate balance was shifting. Diplomats exchanged letters, leaders held private discussions, and newspapers printed speculation about alliances and rivalries. The breeze of curiosity slowly turned into the gusts of vigilance. And yet, for ordinary people, these tensions felt far away. Life went on as it always had. In small towns, blacksmiths shaped iron under steady hammer blows. In cafes, friends shared slices of cake and spoke of family matters, work, and the weather. Children walked to school beneath trees whose leaves shimmered in the sunlight. The world moved gently, even as unseen currents gathered strength beneath the surface. Wilhelm II's reign brought colour and movement to the empire, but it also stirred uncertainties that were difficult to understand from a distance. The balance that Bismarck had nurtured for decades, carefully, patiently, began to tilt ever so slightly. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but like a vessel shifting under new winds. For now, Germany basked in a sense of possibility. It felt bold, industrious, youthful. Yet beneath the surface, quiet questions lingered. How far would these ambitions reach? Would they bring prosperity and recognition, or challenges and strain? The answers lay just beyond the visible horizon, waiting in a world that was changing not only in Germany, but across all of Europe. And as the empire moved forward, the gentle hum of daily life continued, unaware that the currents of the coming decades would test its strength in ways no one could yet imagine. As the 19th century moved steadily toward its close, Germany found itself wrapped in a quiet blend of confidence and curiosity, a nation growing in strength, industry, and ambition. The years under Kaiser Wilhelm II brought a sense of movement, as though the empire had stepped onto a broader stage where new possibilities shimmered just beyond the familiar horizon. In ports, factories, and government halls, a subtle electricity filled the air. It was not frantic or rushed, but rather a steady hum of expectancy, like the soft vibration of a ship at anchor, waiting for the tide to turn. Wilhelm II's fascination with the sea became one of the defining features of this era. Unlike earlier rulers, whose focus had remained largely on the landlocked heart of Europe, Wilhelm felt a deep pull towards the oceans. The sea, to him, represented freedom, opportunity, and the uncharted spaces where Germany might find its future. He often spoke of building a navy worthy of admiration, not for conquest, he insisted, but for dignity, security, and a place among the great maritime powers. To the people living along the North Sea and Baltic shores, this vision arrived first as a change in the rhythm of their daily environment. Shipyards that once crafted fishing vessels and merchant ships began to take on grander projects. Workers wearing heavy gloves and thick aprons hammered sheets of steel into curved hulls that gleamed beneath the pale northern light. Rivets clicked into place in a calming rhythm, echoing gently across the harbours. Cranes creaked as they lifted components into place, silhouettes rising against skies brushed with soft blues and greys. Those who lived near the water would often pause in their routines to watch these enormous structures take shape. Fishermen stepping off their boats glanced upward at the towering frames. Children, cheeks flushed from the cold sea breeze, pointed with wonder at the skeletons of ships that seemed far too large to float. Women passing through market stalls carried fresh bread and fish wrapped in paper, while the distant ring of hammers provided an unending soundtrack to the day. In the evenings, lantern light reflected in the water as workers cleaned their tools, laughter mingling with the slow lap of waves. Further inland, news of naval expansion travelled through newspapers and conversations in cafes. Illustrations of new warships, with their tall masts, broad decks, and powerful engines, captured the imagination of a population increasingly aware of technological possibilities. For many, the expansion of the navy symbolized progress, a sign that Germany, youthful as a unified nation, was stepping forward with the confidence of older powers like Britain and France. Yet beneath this excitement lay currents of quiet complexity. Building a great navy required not only steel and labour, but careful diplomacy. Britain, long the dominant naval power, watched Germany's growing fleet with a mixture of curiosity and unease. International relationships, once stable under Bismarck's cautious guidance, now shifted subtly as Germany's ambitions reached outward across the sea. Still, for ordinary citizens, the world beyond Europe remained distant and abstract. Life continued with familiar rhythms. In the countryside, farmers rose early to tend their fields, their boots brushing through dew-covered grass as mist lifted gently from the ground. Blacksmiths stoked their forges, shaping iron tools that rang with clear, resonant tones. In village squares, markets bustled with fresh produce, woven baskets, and embroidered cloth. These scenes, grounded in tradition, seemed far removed from the great ships being fitted with modern engines on distant coasts. But Germany's attention was not drawn only to the sea. It also turned toward lands far beyond Europe, territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Like other European powers of the era, Germany sought its own place in the global colonial landscape. The motivations were varied and layered. Economic opportunity, national pride, strategic positioning, and sometimes the simple allure of the unfamiliar. Yet for most citizens, these distant regions existed only in stories, maps, and newspaper sketches. German colonies emerged in Southwest Africa, East Africa, Cameroon, Togo, and several Pacific islands. In government halls, officials spoke of bringing order, infrastructure, and commerce to these territories. Adventurers, traders, and missionaries travelled by ship to unfamiliar coasts, where palm trees swayed in warm breezes and new languages filled the air with unfamiliar music. But the reality of colonialism, even softened for sleep storytelling, carried deep complexities. Cultures with long histories encountered a new power whose intentions often mixed curiosity with control. Change arrived quickly in some regions, reshaping trade routes and daily lives. German administrators built roads, railways, and outposts. They introduced new laws and economic systems, sometimes without fully understanding the customs of the people they sought to govern. This brought tensions, some quiet, some painful, and some that would echo through generations. Yet, because this is a sleep narrative focusing on gentleness, we linger not on conflict, but on the broader, softened landscape of Germany's global aspirations. In small towns across the empire, people read accounts of tropical landscapes with wide eyes. They imagined towering mountains cloaked in mist, forests alive with birdsong, and oceans so warm that waves rolled in with soft, rhythmic ease. Children sketched palm trees and elephants in their notebooks, fascinated by the idea of lands where seasons unfolded in ways entirely unlike their own. Scientists, too, found inspiration in these new territories, studying botanical specimens, geological formations, and cultural artifacts brought back by explorers. At exhibitions in Berlin and Hamburg, visitors walked through displays of carved wood, woven fabrics, and shimmering shells. Curators spoke softly about faraway peoples and their traditions, though often through the limited understanding of the time. The atmosphere at these exhibitions blended curiosity with a sense of wonder, an awareness that the world was far larger and richer than many had known. Meanwhile, Germany's industrial centres thrived. Advances in engineering, chemistry, and electricity reshaped daily life. Factories produced goods that travelled not only across Europe, but into Germany's colonies as well. New ports expanded to handle increased trade, their docks lined with crates, barrels, and sacks of materials waiting for transport. The hum of commerce brought prosperity to many families, though it also widened the gap between rapid urban growth and the slower pace of rural life. In the cities, electric lights cast warm glows across evening streets. Streetcars rattled gently past bakeries that stayed open late, their windows filled with pastries that smelled of cinnamon and fresh butter. Conversations drifted from cafe tables, discussions of literature, art, technology, and the ever-growing German presence on the global stage. Newspapers frequently published debates about Germany's role in the world. Should it seek more colonies, more alliances, more recognition? The questions hung in the air like lantern light, bright, open-ended, and filled with possibility. And yet, even as ambitions expanded outward, many Germans cherished the simple anchors of daily life. Families gathered around wooden tables in dimly lit kitchens, sharing bowls of warm soup thick with barley and vegetables. Musicians played violins in town squares as dusk settled over rooftops. School teachers read stories aloud while the smell of chalk and pine floor polish mingled gently in the classroom. These moments, quiet and familiar, offered comfort in a time of growing national pride and global curiosity. Along the coasts, however, the spirit of Wilhelm II's naval dreams was most palpable. As Germany's new fleets took shape, sailors trained aboard practice vessels that rocked gently in the harbour. They learned navigation, signalling, and the maintenance of complex machinery. On calm mornings, they scrubbed decks that reflected the first hints of sunrise. On windy days, they tightened ropes while listening to the rhythmic creaking of masts. Many felt a deep sense of purpose, pride in serving a navy that symbolized Germany's aspirations. When new ships were launched, the ceremonies were often simple but joyful. Crowds gathered on the docks as the vessel slid gracefully into the water, its hull slicing a smooth arc through the surface. People cheered softly, waving hats and handkerchiefs. The ship, still smelling faintly of fresh paint, bobbed gently as if adjusting to the embrace of the sea. These ships were not merely tools of power. In the minds of many, they were symbols of Germany's place in the modern world, proof that the young empire could shape its own destiny among the great nations. Still, beneath the excitement, some sensed unease. Older generations remembered Bismarck's warnings against reaching too far, too fast. Diplomats whispered of shifting alliances and rising tensions. Britain watched the German navy grow with tightening concern. France, still carrying the memory of 1871, viewed Germany's outward expansion with wary eyes. And across the empire, thoughtful citizens wondered quietly how ambition and caution might find equilibrium. That equilibrium, however, would soon be tested. For now, Germany basked in the glow of progress, its industries thriving, its fleets expanding, its global presence increasing. The air of possibility felt warm and bright, like sunlight reflecting across calm waters. Yet just beyond this shimmer of optimism, subtle ripples formed. Ripples that hinted at deeper currents beneath the surface of Europe's political landscape. Ripples that would, in time, gather into larger waves. But on the eve of the 20th century, those currents remained faint, overshadowed by the sense of promise that filled the empire. And in homes across Germany, families drifted to sleep beneath soft lamplight, unaware that the dreams of a global empire, so inspiring, so full of hope, were gently leading their nation toward a future both luminous and challenging. As the 19th century slowly gave way to the 20th, a quiet unease began to settle over Europe, subtle at first, like a faint tremor beneath the earth that only the attentive could feel. On the surface, daily life continued with reassuring normalcy. Families gathered for meals, fields ripened in the summer sun, and shopkeepers opened their doors each morning to greet familiar faces. The continent's great cities glowed with electric light, a symbol of modern progress, while towns and villages continued to hum with the comfortable rhythms of tradition. Yet beneath this outward tranquility, something fragile had begun to shift. The alliances that bound nations together, once steady, cautious, and deliberate, now felt strained under the weight of changing ambitions. The German Empire, youthful and energetic under Wilhelm II, found itself at the centre of a continent where pride and uncertainty mingled in unpredictable ways. Europe had become a tapestry woven from threads of rivalry, admiration, caution, and fear, threads that now tightened in ways few fully understood. For years, Bismarck's diplomacy had kept these threads in delicate balance. He had known that Europe, with its long memories and its maze of borders, required reassurance more than bold display. But after Bismarck stepped away from leadership, that balance slowly began to tilt. Wilhelm II, confident in his vision of Germany's greatness, believed that the empire could shape its own path without the meticulous restraint of earlier years. He spoke passionately of Germany's destiny, its industry, its navy, and the promise of a brighter future. Many citizens found his optimism inspiring. Others worried that the caution of previous decades was slipping quietly through the cracks. Germany's naval expansion, which had stirred such enthusiasm at home, now echoed across Europe. Britain, whose power had long rested upon mastery of the seas, watched Germany's growing fleet with increasing vigilance. Each new ship launched in German ports felt like a distant ripple reaching British shores, stirring conversations among sailors, merchants, and political leaders. Though no hostile words were exchanged, both nations sensed a new rivalry forming, not loud, not aggressive, but steady and persistent, like two tides beginning to push gently against one another. France, still healing from the wounds of 1871, felt its own mixture of concern and introspection. The loss of Alsace and Lorraine remained a tender memory, one that tugged at national pride with quiet insistence. The sight of a confident, unified Germany, growing stronger each year, stirred emotions that flickered beneath the polite exchanges of diplomacy. Though life continued peacefully in French villages, vines growing heavy with grapes, children playing beside fountains in shaded squares, many citizens sensed that Europe's shifting power dynamics might one day demand reckoning. Meanwhile, in the vast lands of Russia, change simmered beneath the surface in its own way. The empire was immense, stretching across miles of forests, plains, and frozen steppe. Its people, diverse and resilient, faced economic hardships and political uncertainties that even the Tsar's authority could not fully soothe. When Germany considered its alliances, Russia's internal pressures added another layer of complexity to the fragile equilibrium of the continent. Austria-Hungary too stood at a crossroads, an empire composed of many cultures, languages, and histories, Its leaders sought stability, yet the pull of nationalism among its peoples created gentle but persistent cracks. To Germany, Austria-Hungary remained a valued ally, bound by shared traditions and strategic interests. But even this alliance required careful tending, for the empire's internal tensions carried the potential to influence all of Europe. Despite these shifting dynamics, most German citizens experienced these years not as a march toward conflict, but as a time of steady cultural and economic growth. The everyday world remained full of small joys and familiar comforts. In Berlin, cafes glowed warmly on chilly evenings as friends gathered to share steaming cups of coffee. In Hamburg, fishermen returned to harbour at dawn, their boats heavy with the morning catch. In Munich, musicians played violins and cellos beneath lanterns that cast soft halos of light. Children attended school with satchels full of books, their imaginations filled with stories of explorers, inventors, and the wonders of science. Factories continued to hum, producing tools, textiles, and finely crafted goods that made their way across Europe. Trains rolled smoothly along steel rails that seemed to stitch the empire together, carrying passengers who leaned back in their seats as countryside landscapes passed gently before their eyes. Yet even in this atmosphere of progress, subtle signs hinted that not all was calm beneath the surface. Diplomatic discussions grew more frequent and more tense. Military planners across Europe, quiet men in tidy offices, began drafting contingency plans, though they hoped never to use them. Newspapers published articles about rising international competition, their tone cautious rather than alarming. Intellectuals debated the future of Europe in salons and university halls, sensing that the continent was entering a new and uncertain chapter. One of the strongest undercurrents of tension came from the complex alliances that now bound nations together. Germany found itself intricately linked with Austria-Hungary, while France sought closer ties with Russia. Britain, once aloof from continental entanglements, began to consider partnerships of its own. These alliances were meant to create security, but instead they wove Europe into a network so tightly connected that any small disturbance might send tremors through the entire system. Yet ordinary citizens, living quiet and hopeful lives, felt far removed from these political chessboards. In small villages, the cycle of the seasons remained the truest marker of time. Winter brought crisp air and cozy gatherings around warm stoves. Spring filled meadows with fresh blossoms and renewed energy. Summer offered long, bright days, perfect for tending gardens and enjoying outdoor markets. Autumn painted forests in rich golds and reds, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. Farmers rose before sunrise, regardless of diplomatic tensions. Artisans crafted beautiful pieces from wood, glass, and metal. Families gathered for celebrations, birthdays, weddings, and religious holidays. The laughter of children echoed through courtyards untouched by the shifting moods of international relations. Though leaders watched the horizon with increasing caution, the people sought comfort in familiar routines, trusting that peace would endure as it always had. Even so, a faint change in the atmosphere touched the edges of daily life. Young men, especially those living in cities, noticed increased discussions about military service, training, and preparedness. Though conscription was part of life in many European nations, something about the tone felt subtly different, more focused, more expectant. Still, for most families, these developments remained distant, softened by the hope that all nations desired peace. Travelers moving across the continent sensed the same subtle tension. In train compartments, conversations sometimes drifted to international affairs before returning to lighter topics. In ports, sailors spoke of naval expansions and shifting alliances as they repaired ropes or loaded cargo. In university lecture halls, professors encouraged students to consider the responsibilities of modern nations, how they must balance ambition with accountability, progress with diplomacy. But even with these undercurrents, the world of the early 1900s remained full of glittering promise. Scientific breakthroughs illuminated evenings spent with newspapers and journals. Art and music flourished, carrying audiences into new worlds of imagination. Technological marvels, from electric trams to early automobiles, hinted at a future filled with innovation. These developments sparkled like stars above the continent, drawing the eye upward and outward, away from the shadows that lingered quietly below. For Germany, the dream of shaping its destiny remained strong. Its industries continued to expand, its cities buzzed with cultural life, and its young people looked toward the future with bright eyes. Yet behind the scenes, the delicate balance of Europe wavered ever so slightly with each passing year. Diplomats sensed it in the shifting tones of negotiations. Leaders felt it in the changing priorities of their counterparts. Journalists saw it in the subtle patterns emerging across political headlines. And occasionally, an ordinary citizen might notice it in a quiet moment. The sense that the world was holding its breath, waiting for something just beyond the horizon. But no one could yet imagine the scale of what lay ahead. For now, Europe drifted, slowly, gently, almost imperceptibly, toward a future shaped by forces deeper than any single ambition or decision. A future that would test the bonds between nations, challenge the resilience of societies, and alter the lives of millions. Yet on the eve of this transformation, the continent still glowed with the peaceful light of ordinary life. The sun continued to rise over quiet fields. Rivers flowed with steady grace. Lanterns flickered warmly in evening windows. Families slept beneath the soft rustle of curtains stirred by night breezes. And as Germany looked toward the new century with hope and determination, the tension beneath the surface, still faint, still distant, waited patiently for the winds of change to gather strength. When the summer of 1914 arrived, it came softly at first, wrapped in warm breezes and golden light that shimmered across the fields and riverbanks of Europe. Farmers bent over ripening crops, children splashed in shallow streams, and families gathered in shaded gardens where linden trees whispered in the gentle wind. Nothing in these peaceful scenes hinted that the continent stood on the verge of a transformation so vast that it would touch every household, every village, every silent road stretching toward the horizon. The spark that set events into motion began far from Germany's quiet landscapes, in a place most of its citizens had never seen. A sudden tragedy in the Balkans rippled outward through Europe's tightly woven alliances, unsettling the delicate balance that had held for decades. At first, many believed that diplomacy would calm the tension, that reason, caution, and conversation would guide leaders back from the brink. But the alliances, created to protect nations, now tugged them forward with unexpected force. One declaration followed another, as if each were a stone dropped into a pond, whose ripples pushed the next into motion. Soon, Nations that had once shared music, trade, and cultural admiration found themselves drawn into a conflict none had truly desired. In Germany, news of mobilization reached cities and villages with a mixture of disbelief and solemn acceptance. Young men received letters instructing them to report for service. Train stations once filled with merchants and travelers now welcomed lines of recruits, carrying small bundles tied with careful knots. Mothers stood close to their sons, adjusting collars or brushing dust from jackets with trembling hands. Fathers offered firm embraces, though their eyes revealed the quiet unsteadiness of the moment. And yet, even in this uncertainty, a sense of duty softened the fear. Many believed the conflict would be brief. Home by Christmas, whispers said, an unfortunate but short-lived storm that would soon pass. People clung to this hope, wrapping it gently around their hearts like a protective cloak. In the early weeks, the war felt distant to many. Soldiers boarded trains that moved steadily through the countryside, their whistles carrying through open fields. Children waved from fences, not yet understanding the gravity of the moment. Inside the trains, young men spoke softly about home, about the meals they missed, the fields they once tended, the workshops where they had shaped wood or metal with their hands. Some glanced through windows at the passing scenery, woods bathed in summer glow, flocks of birds circling above, village steeples rising gently against the sky, feeling both pride and homesickness in a single breath. Back home, life continued, though with a subtle shift. Women stepped into new roles, managing farms, workshops, and shops with quiet resilience. Teachers reassured students with steady voices, even as they kept newspapers folded on their desks. Letters became lifelines, carrying love, news, and encouragement across miles of uncertainty. Each envelope, touched by hands far away, brought a sense of connection, a reminder that though the war stretched outward across borders, the bonds of family and friendship remained strong. In the cities, factories redirected their efforts towards supporting the war. Workers shaped steel, assembled machinery, and packed supplies with careful precision. The hum of industry, once a sign of progress, now carried a deeper tone, one of responsibility, urgency, and the collective effort of a nation. As the months passed, the war did not fade as many had hoped. Instead, it settled across Europe like a heavy mist. The old strategies of swift battle gave way to long, difficult stalemates. Soldiers found themselves in unfamiliar landscapes, where the earth bore the marks of conflict and the air carried the muted sound of distant movement. Yet even amid these hardships, small moments of humanity offered comfort. The sharing of a warm drink on a cold morning, the quiet telling of stories beneath dim lantern light, the memory of home, carried like a soft ember in the heart. For families in Germany, seasons continued their gentle cycles, marking time with familiar signs. Autumn arrived, painting forests in copper and gold. Winter followed, laying quiet blankets of snow across rooftops and farm fields. Kitchens filled with the scent of stews and freshly baked bread, offering warmth against the long nights. People gathered for holidays, lighting candles and singing songs with voices that trembled softly, but still sang. As the war stretched on, shortages touched daily life. Some foods grew scarce, and people learned to adapt with creativity and patience. Neighbours shared what they could, strengthening bonds that had always held communities together. Gardens transformed into essential spaces for growing vegetables. Markets became places not only of trade, but of comfort, where familiar faces offered reassurance simply by being present. In villages, elders spoke to younger generations about endurance, how the land had weathered storms before, how people had always found ways to rebuild, how even in the hardest seasons, human kindness could carry them through. Their words, spoken over warm cups of tea or beside crackling stoves, offered the kind of hope that settles quietly into the soul. Still, the strain of the war touched every part of the empire. Letters arrived less frequently for some families, each delayed envelope increasing the quiet ache of worry. The government encouraged thrift and unity, reminding citizens that their collective effort mattered. Churches opened their doors for those seeking comfort, their bells ringing gently at dusk, calling communities together for moments of reflection and prayer. Yet despite the burden, the human spirit found ways to shine softly through the shadows. Musicians played in town squares, lifting morale with familiar melodies. Students studied diligently, believing that learning would help rebuild a peaceful future. Artists sketched the world around them, capturing scenes of resilience, children playing in courtyards, women carrying baskets through snowy streets, men repairing tools by lamplight. These small acts of creativity wove threads of hope through the fabric of daily life. By the third year of the war, most citizens understood that the conflict would not simply fade like a passing storm. It had become part of the landscape of their lives. Families adapted their routines, and communities supported each other with quiet determination. But beneath this resilience, a collective longing grew, a longing for calm, for reunion, for the gentle world that had existed before the war. In the midst of these heavy years, Germany still found moments of beauty. Spring blossoms returned, soft petals drifting through the air like whispers of renewal. Rivers continued their timeless journey toward the sea. Birds sang at dawn, unaware of human struggles, reminding listeners that nature's rhythms persisted, steady, reliable, and comforting. And through it all, a realization slowly took shape within Germany, that the war, once expected to be brief, now tested the empire's strength in ways never imagined. Not simply the strength of armies, but the strength of its people, their patience, courage, and ability to hold on to hope even as the world shifted around them. The empire stood at the edge of its endurance, facing pressures both external and internal. But its heart still beat with the quiet determination of millions who wanted nothing more than peace, stability, and a return to the gentle rhythms of everyday life. The next years would bring new challenges, ones that touched not only distant fronts, but the very center of German society. Yet even as darkness pressed closer, the seeds of resilience remained, waiting for the moment when light would return. As the war stretched into its later years, the quiet streets, farmlands, and river valleys of Germany became places where endurance and hope intertwined like two threads of the same fabric. Though the front lines lay far from many homes, the echoes of the conflict reached every village and town in gentle but undeniable ways. Life behind the lines was not marked by dramatic scenes, but by the quiet strength of ordinary people carrying on with steady hearts. In small rural communities, dawn still arrived with its familiar calm. The first light touched fields that had been tended by generations, casting pale gold across rows of grain that whispered softly in the morning breeze. Farmers rose early, pulling on heavy boots and stepping into the cool air to care for their crops and animals. With many of the younger men away, the rhythm of work shifted. Mothers, daughters, and elderly relatives shouldered new responsibilities, guiding ploughs, repairing fences, and carrying baskets of feed to waiting animals. Their steps were sure, even if their thoughts sometimes drifted to loved ones far from home. Villagers supported one another in ways both practical and gentle. A neighbour might help mend a roof or share a portion of a harvest. Children, sensing the strain around them, often took on small tasks with newfound maturity, sweeping barns, gathering eggs, or delivering letters to nearby houses. Their presence, full of innocence and determination, brought lightness to days that sometimes felt heavy. In towns and cities, the changes were more noticeable, yet life still moved with an undercurrent of steadiness. Streets bustled each morning as shopkeepers opened their doors, arranging what goods they could on wooden shelves. Markets, though quieter than before, still welcomed people with the soft murmur of conversation and the scent of bread freshly pulled from ovens. Even when ingredients were scarce, bakers found ways to create warm, comforting loaves that reminded customers of gentler times. Women became the backbone of urban life. They worked in offices, taught in classrooms, volunteered in hospitals, and laboured in factories where machines hummed steadily from dawn until dusk. Their movements carried a mixture of purpose and grace. They wrote letters at night by lamplight, cleaned soot from children's coats, and kept family traditions alive as best they could. Despite shortages, people found creative ways to adapt. Gardens blossomed in unexpected places, behind apartment buildings, beside workshop walls, even on rooftops, where soil was carried up in small wooden boxes. Herbs, potatoes, and carrots sprouted in neat rows, each one tended with care. These green spaces became places of solace, offering moments of peaceful routine amid the uncertainty of wartime. And there were moments of quiet joy too. Families gathered in living rooms warmed by coal stoves, sharing stories, knitting socks for loved ones, or reading aloud from well-worn books. Children played simple games in courtyards, their laughter rising like soft bells into the evening air. On Sundays, people walked slowly through parks, watching leaves ripple in gentle breezes, or snowflakes gather in soft drifts on benches and pathways. Letters from the front were treasured above all. When a postman appeared on a familiar street, footsteps quickened and windows opened. Envelopes travelled through many hands before reaching home, carrying words that offered comfort, reassurance, and connection. Even a few short sentences, "I am well," or "I think of you often," became cherished messages, read again and again beside fading candlelight. And when letters did not arrive, neighbours offered comfort, sharing hope and listening with quiet compassion. Communities found strength in gathering. Churches and meeting halls hosted small concerts or readings, moments when music or poetry softened the weight of daily worries. Choirs performed gentle hymns that echoed through vaulted spaces, their harmonies lifting spirits like warm currents of air. Musicians played lullabies and familiar folk tunes, reminding listeners of the beauty that still existed in the world. The spirit of generosity grew stronger even as resources grew thinner. Some families donated clothing they could spare. Others saved small portions of food for relief efforts. School children collected coins for charity boxes, proud of their contribution no matter how small. Every act, however simple, illuminated the resilience of the home front, proof that even in challenging times, kindness could flourish. As winter returned each year, its familiar touch wrapped cities and villages in hushed stillness. Snow gathered on rooftops and softened the edges of busy streets. Icicles formed along eaves like crystal ornaments, shimmering gently when touched by lantern light. Indoors, warm meals simmered in pots, filling homes with the comforting aroma of broth, herbs, and root vegetables. Families sat close together, drawing solace from one another's presence. Yet even in these moments of calm, the strain of the war pressed upon the empire. Supplies dwindled, and long months of sacrifice weighed heavily on many hearts. Still, the people of Germany, civilians of all ages and walks of life, showed remarkable endurance. They moved forward one day at a time, trusting that each small effort, each gesture of patience, each whispered prayer or hopeful thought contributed to the resilience of their communities. Some evenings, as dusk settled gently over towns and villages, the glow of lamplight illuminated windows where families paused in quiet reflection. They listened to the soft ticking of clocks, the distant bark of a dog, the wind brushing gently against shutters. In these moments, the lines between worry and hope blurred. People drew their blankets closer, breathed deeply, and reminded themselves that no hardship lasted forever. Children, sensing the heaviness of the times in ways they could not fully understand, often asked simple questions. When will things be peaceful again? Parents answered with soft voices and gentle smiles, reminding them that the world was full of seasons, some difficult, some light, and that spring always followed winter. These reassurances, though small, warmed the home like a quiet flame. As the war neared its later stages, cracks began to appear in the empire's strength. Economic pressures grew, and the strain reached households that had once felt insulated from hardship. Yet even in these challenging moments, the spirit of unity persisted. People leaned on one another, shared burdens, and offered comfort in countless small ways. They believed with a quiet determination that compassion could be a refuge even when the world felt unsteady. By 1917 and 1918, fatigue touched nearly every corner of German society. Yet so did a longing for peace, deep, collective, and profound. This longing drifted through conversations at market stalls, beside factory gates and across kitchen tables. It accompanied people as they walked home in the fading light, shadowed by both sorrow and hope. And still, the human heart found ways to stay gentle. Mothers kissed children softly on their foreheads. Friends shared small jokes to lighten the day. Travellers offered their seats to elders on crowded trams. Simple gestures became quiet acts of resilience, reminders that even amidst strain, the world still held warmth and goodness. As the war moved toward its end, Germany stood at the edge of transformation. Behind the lines, millions of civilians had shaped their days with courage, tenderness, and unshakable hope. They had waited, endured, and supported one another through years of uncertainty, anchoring the empire in humanity, even as its political foundations began to tremble. Soon, great change would sweep across the nation. A change felt not only at the front, but in homes, streets, and fields throughout the land. But for now, behind the lines, life continued with quiet dignity. And in that dignity lay the strength that carried Germany through its hardest years. By the final year of the war, the German Empire felt as though it were standing on a thin sheet of ice, one that had held firm through years of strain, but now creaked softly beneath each passing month. The people had endured so much with quiet determination. Shortages, separation from loved ones, long hours of labour, and the emotional weight of uncertainty. Yet even the strongest hearts felt the growing heaviness in the air, a heaviness that suggested the familiar world was drawing closer to a moment of profound change. On the front lines, soldiers who had once marched with hopeful spirits now moved with a steady weariness. They still performed their duties with courage, but the strain was visible in their tired eyes, their slower steps, and the gentle sighs they released between tasks. The conflict had stretched far longer than anyone had imagined, turning once temporary encampments into places that felt almost permanent. And though bravery remained, the ability to press on without pause began to ebb. Behind the lines, Germany's civilians sensed this same shift. Markets were quieter, their shelves thinner. Families learned to stretch ingredients in creative ways, turning roots, grains and herbs into nourishing meals that warmed hearts, even if they could not always fill stomachs. Factories worked tirelessly, but many lacked the supplies needed to maintain their usual pace. Workers persevered nonetheless, driven by loyalty, routine, and the quiet hope that their efforts still made a difference. Letters from the front, once steady streams of ink and affection, grew fewer as the war's demands increased. Families waited with a patience sharpened by years of practice, sitting beside windows or checking mailboxes as though listening for a familiar voice carried on the wind. Each arrival brought relief. Each silence brought worry. Still, neighbours supported one another, offering warm tea, gentle words, and shared strength. By late 1918, the strain of these years touched every corner of the empire, from the smallest rural hamlets to Berlin's broad boulevards. People sensed that the war, and perhaps something larger, was reaching a turning point. Conversations, though quiet and careful, reflected this awareness. "How much longer?" some asked softly. "What comes next?" wondered others, not in fear, but in the tender tone of those who have weathered many storms and long for calm skies. As the military situation worsened, German leaders faced difficult decisions. Reports from the front carried stark news. Supplies dwindled, exhaustion spread, and the prospects of holding the lines grew dimmer by the day. Across Europe, nations felt similar strains, for the war had weighed heavily upon all. But in Germany, where unity had once been a source of strength, fatigue now seeped into the empire's foundations. In the ports along the northern coast, a quiet but decisive moment unfolded. Sailors, long devoted and disciplined, received orders that felt too heavy to bear. Orders that suggested one final risky display of force. But these men, who had seen the toll of years and understood the shifting tides of war, felt deep in their hearts that such a step would bring nothing but needless loss. And so, in an act not of rebellion but of weary wisdom, many refused. This peaceful refusal, born from concern for lives rather than defiance, sent ripples through the empire. Word travelled quickly along rail lines, through factories, into city squares, and across farms where people paused mid-task to take in the news. The sailors' decision resonated with a population already stretched thin. It gave shape to emotions many had held quietly for years: exhaustion, longing for peace, and a gentle insistence that humanity mattered more than conflict. In cities like Berlin, Kiel, and Munich, demonstrations began to form, small at first, then growing as more people joined with calm voices and steady steps. These gatherings were not fueled by anger, so much as by hope. People stood shoulder to shoulder, calling for peace, for representation, for a future where the burdens of war would no longer press upon their homes. Flags waved softly in the autumn wind, and banners carried messages shaped not by ideology, but by a yearning for dignity and stability. The empire, once held together by firm leadership and shared purpose, now felt the effects of this collective awakening. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had guided Germany through years of ambition and challenge, faced a nation whose needs had shifted. Many people respected him, but they also understood that the moment required a new kind of leadership, one suited to healing rather than expansion, to rebuilding rather than striving. In early November, Wilhelm II stepped aside, leaving the political stage with a mixture of solemnity and acceptance. His departure did not bring celebration, but a quiet, reflective silence, an acknowledgement of the weight he had carried and the uncertainty that now lay ahead. The monarchy, a central pillar of the empire since its founding, gently dissolved into memory. Germany became a republic almost overnight, not through violence, but through the collective exhale of a nation ready for change. For many citizens, the transition felt surreal. They woke the next morning to the same soft light pouring through their windows, the same familiar routines of preparing breakfast or sweeping steps, yet the world had shifted. Conversations at markets and in workshops carried a new tone, cautious, curious, but tinged with relief. The war had not yet fully ended, but the path toward peace had begun to take visible form. In rural villages, farmers paused during chores to discuss the news with neighbours, leaning over fences dusted with morning frost. In cities, people gathered calmly in public squares, listening to announcements read aloud in measured voices. Old and young alike sensed that they were standing in a moment that would one day be remembered as a turning point, one that required patience, kindness, and steady courage. And then, on November 11th, 1918, the armistice arrived. The war's relentless march came to a halt. Bells rang across towns and villages, their tones gentle yet profound. People wept, embraced, and stood in stunned silence. The relief that washed over the empire felt soft but deep, like a warm tide gently rising after years of storm. Yet the end of conflict did not erase the challenges that lay ahead. Germany now faced shortages, political uncertainty, and the emotional weight of years spent in hardship. Still, the people, shaped by endurance and quiet strength, were ready to begin the work of rebuilding. They knew the path would be long, but they also understood that healing begins not with grand gestures, but with small acts of care and perseverance. That winter, as snow fell softly across rooftops and fields, families gathered around stoves to share warm meals and speak of the future with cautious hope. Children listened as elders offered reassurance. That peace, once given room to grow, could spread like spring blossoms after a long frost. And though the empire had changed irrevocably, the hearts of its people continued to beat with gentleness, resilience, and the universal longing for a better tomorrow. Ahead lay a period of uncertainty, reflection, and renewal, but also the quiet possibility of beginning again. As autumn deepened across the German lands in 1918, the season's quiet transformations seemed to mirror the changes unfolding within the German Empire itself. Leaves loosened their gentle hold on branches, drifting softly to the earth. Mornings arrived cool and silver, with fog lingering over river banks, and across villages, cities, and countryside paths, People moved with a cautious awareness that the world they had known for nearly half a century was slowly dissolving into something new. The empire had been born in a moment of triumph inside the glittering hall of mirrors at Versailles. Now it approached its end in scenes far humbler, city squares filled not with celebration, but with weary citizens seeking answers. Quiet offices where officials drafted messages of transition, and rural homes where families whispered to one another, wondering what tomorrow might bring. It was not a collapse marked by chaos or fire, but a gentle unraveling, like an old tapestry slowly releasing the threads that had once bound it tightly together. After years of hardship, Germany stood at the edge of exhaustion. Food supplies ran thin, industries strained under the demands of war, and families carried the emotional weight of separation and loss. And yet beneath these burdens something else stirred, a longing for peace and a yearning for a different kind of future, one shaped not by imperial ambitions, but by the quiet hopes of ordinary people. The moment that symbolized this shift most clearly came with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The news arrived not with spectacle, but with a somber inevitability. In towns and cities, newspapers printed the announcement in careful lines of ink. People paused as they read, some lowering the paper slowly, others folding it with trembling hands. Wilhelm had been a constant presence for decades, seen in photographs, heard in speeches, admired and criticized in equal measure. His departure marked the end of an era, and even those who had disagreed with his choices felt a quiet ache at the magnitude of the transition. In Berlin, the heart of the empire, crowds gathered along avenues lined with buildings that had witnessed so much history. Their steps echoed softly on the pavement as they listened to speeches delivered from balconies and platforms. Yet the atmosphere was not violent or vengeful. Instead, it felt like the gentle exhale of a nation releasing years of tension. People stood closely together, offering warmth and reassurance in the chill November air. They carried lanterns, banners and flags, symbols not of division, but of the hope for a peaceful path forward. Wilhelm II, once the central figure of the empire, now departed quietly from political life. He travelled away from Germany, finding refuge in a foreign land where he would spend his remaining years. For him, the transition was deeply personal, a moment of reflection, solitude, and acceptance. And for Germany, it marked the closing of a chapter whose final pages had been written by the pressures of war and the deep yearning for renewal among its people. Yet even as the monarchy dissolved, the fabric of daily life remained remarkably steady. In villages, families continued their routines of tending to fields, chopping wood, and gathering for meals. In towns, bakers still lit their ovens before dawn, filling early streets with the comforting warmth of freshly baked bread. Children walked to school with satchels bouncing gently against their sides, their cheeks pink from the crisp morning air. Life, with its quiet rhythms, persisted as though reminding the empire that change need not extinguish familiarity. Then, on November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed, a moment that arrived as softly as the first snowfall of winter. Church bells rang across the land, their tones rich and soothing. People stepped outside to listen, tears welling in tired eyes. The war that had cast its long shadow over every home, every field, every thought had come to an end. Relief washed through communities like a warm tide, easing the heaviness that had settled in so many hearts. The end of conflict did not bring immediate clarity. Germany now faced a landscape reshaped by uncertainty, political transformation, economic strain, and the emotional work of healing from years of hardship. Yet even in this uncertainty, sparks of hope glimmered. Citizens came together to clean public spaces, reopen businesses, and support those who had suffered most. Volunteers delivered food and clothing to struggling families. Teachers welcomed children back into classrooms, offering lessons that encouraged curiosity rather than fear. Musicians performed in parks and squares, their notes drifting gently through the cold autumn air, lifting spirits in ways words alone could not. Across the countryside, nature offered its own quiet reassurance. Winter settled softly upon forests and farmlands, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Rivers flowed steadily beneath thin layers of ice, their murmurs a reminder of continuity. Birds gathered in small flocks, tracing delicate arcs across pale skies. Families sat near crackling stoves, watching firelight dance across walls as they spoke of the past with tenderness, and the future with cautious optimism. With the monarchy dissolved, Germany transitioned into a republic, its leadership shifting to new voices shaped not by royal lineage, but by political participation. This new era carried both promise and challenge. Many citizens embraced the chance to shape their nation through democratic means, while others felt uncertain about what such change might bring. But as the empire faded from political reality, its cultural and emotional legacy remained, felt in the architecture of city centres, in the stories shared between generations, and in the quiet pride carried by those who had lived through both its rise and its end. The Treaty of Versailles, signed months later, would bring its own set of burdens. The terms were difficult, reshaping borders, responsibilities, and national identity. Yet even here, the German people responded with a resilience born of experience. They worked to rebuild their towns, restore their communities, and find stability in an unfamiliar world. They planted gardens, reopened shops, repaired railways, and found comfort in each other's company. Grand ambitions gave way to gentler dreams, dreams of peace, prosperity, and a life where children could once again laugh without the backdrop of worry. The end of the Kaiserreich did not erase the decades that had come before. The stories of its birth, its expansion, its hopes, and its trials remained woven into the collective memory of the nation. And for those who reflected in the quiet hours of evening, by lamplight, beside a warm hearth, or beneath a winter sky filled with stars, the empire's history felt less like a vanished world, and more like a chapter whose lessons would guide the ones yet to come. Soon, Germany would step into the complex, challenging years of the Weimar Republic. But the gentle unravelling of the empire, though filled with sorrow and uncertainty, had also cleared a path for renewal. And in the hush that followed the war's end, the people breathed deeply, hopeful that the next dawn would rise with a softer, steadier light. In the quiet months that followed the armistice, Germany found itself standing in a landscape both familiar and profoundly changed. The fields still stretched calmly beneath winter skies, rivers continued their unhurried journeys toward the sea, and the daily rhythms of life carried people gently from morning to evening. Yet the empire that had once woven these lands together no longer existed. Its dissolution left behind a tender ache, an echo that lingered in memory, in conversations spoken softly at kitchen tables, and in the uncertain hopes of a nation searching for its next path. The weeks after the Kaiser's abdication brought a mixture of relief, confusion, and quiet apprehension. On the streets of Berlin, where demonstrations had recently surged with energy and emotion, a calmer mood settled. Snow drifted gently between the tall buildings, softening their sharp edges. People walked more slowly now, bundled in wool coats, their breath curling into the crisp air. The heavy weight of war had lifted, but the lightness of peace had not yet fully taken its place. Germany found itself negotiating the transition from empire to republic, a shift that required patience, cooperation, and the steady work of rebuilding trust in institutions shaken by years of hardship. In town halls, officials spoke earnestly with citizens, answering questions and encouraging participation in the new democratic framework. Newspapers printed explanations of upcoming elections and constitutional changes. Teachers discussed the meaning of civic responsibility with their students, reminding them that the future of the nation would rest on many hands, not just a few. Yet beneath these hopeful steps, uncertainty lingered. Supplies remained scarce, and inflation quietly nibbled at the value of money. Families saved what they could, stretching portions of bread and potatoes to last through long evenings. Tailors repaired worn clothing with careful stitches. Markets, though open, displayed fewer goods than before. Still, people found ways to adapt, binding themselves together through small acts of generosity. A shared loaf, a borrowed tool, a warm embrace offered at the right moment. While Germany worked to rebuild internally, the world beyond its borders turned toward the task of shaping peace. This process, long and complicated, culminated in the Treaty of Versailles, a document whose pages carried enormous weight. Delegates from many nations gathered in the very palace where the German Empire had been born in 1871. Now, the hall that had once echoed with proclamations of unity became the setting for decisions that would reshape Germany's future in ways few could yet imagine. The treaty introduced conditions that struck Germany deeply. Borders shifted, territories were reassigned, and financial reparations were imposed. Though the treaty aimed to secure peace, many Germans experienced it as a heavy burden, one that arrived at a moment when the country already felt fragile. The news travelled swiftly through towns and villages, carried by newspapers folded under arms and by voices sharing the latest developments, over fences, in factories, and along quiet roads. The reactions were varied, but often tinged with sadness. In small rural homes, families read the treaty's terms aloud, sitting around wooden tables worn smooth by generations of meals. Some bowed their heads, absorbing the weight of the words. Others looked at their children and wondered how best to guide them into this unfamiliar future. Yet even in their disappointment, many carried themselves with dignity, reminding one another that resilience, not despair, would shape Germany's next chapter. In cities, the treaty's effects appeared more quickly. The economy wavered, then trembled. Prices rose faster than wages, leaving families scrambling to afford basic necessities. Bread that once cost a few coins now demanded handfuls. Children carried satchels, not only of school books, but sometimes of banknotes, so numerous they barely fit inside. People learned to navigate these strange new realities with a mixture of creativity and patience. They bartered goods, repaired items rather than buying replacements, and leaned on neighbours for support. Through all this, the Republic struggled to find steady footing. Political parties competed for influence, offering visions of recovery and stability that often clashed. Debates echoed in parliament chambers lit by the soft glow of gas lamps, the voices rising and falling like waves against a rocky shore. The streets outside sometimes reflected these tensions, with gatherings that swelled into demonstrations, their mood shifting from hope to frustration and back again. Yet alongside the turmoil, Germany experienced pockets of remarkable cultural vitality, quiet blossoms of creativity that appeared even in challenging soil. In cities like Berlin, artists and thinkers explored new ideas in studios filled with the scent of paint and turpentine. Writers gathered in cafes where the air buzzed with literary discussions and the clinking of spoons against porcelain cups. Composers experimented with fresh harmonies, filling concert halls with music that captured the emotions of a society in transition. Melancholy, longing, and fragile optimism. Even the simplest moments offered glimpses of renewal. A child practicing piano in a dim living room, a couple walking arm in arm through a snow-kissed park, a group of friends laughing in the warmth of a small kitchen while sharing a modest meal. These gentle scenes, woven into the fabric of daily life, reminded people that beauty and tenderness could endure even in uncertain times. Across the countryside, many communities attempted to restore normalcy by focusing on the rhythms of the land. Farmers ploughed fields softened by spring rains, sowing seeds that held promise for the year ahead. Shepherds guided flocks across hills that glowed under the light of early morning. Families tended gardens, watching sprouts emerge with quiet satisfaction. Nature, steady and unhurried, seemed to whisper encouragement. That life renews itself, that seasons turn, and that even after hardship, there is room for growth. Still, the echo of the empire lingered. Older generations remembered the years of unity, pride, and transformation. They spoke of the early decades of the Kaiserreich, with its expanding railways, cultural achievements, and unifying ceremonies. They recalled the hopes that had once filled the nation and the challenges that gradually shaped its destiny. These stories were shared not as longing for the past, but as guidance for the future. Gentle reminders of what had been gained, what had been lost, and what might yet be rebuilt. As the early 1920s unfolded, Germany's challenges deepened. The economy fluctuated wildly, sometimes stabilizing for a moment, only to falter again. Political divisions grew sharper, yet even amid these difficulties, small rays of hope glimmered. New leaders emerged who sought compromise, cooperation, and gradual recovery. International agreements began to soften some of the burdens imposed by the treaty. And within German society, many people discovered renewed determination, an understanding that rebuilding would take time, but that healing was possible. Quiet resilience became the nation's guiding force. Communities organized cooperative kitchens to support families in need. Teachers encouraged students to dream beyond the troubles of the moment. Medics tended to the sick with gentle care. Musicians lifted spirits with melodies that drifted through open windows on warm evenings. In each of these acts, large and small, the German people demonstrated a truth they had carried through every era, that hope survives best when shared. By the mid-1920s, signs of stabilization began to appear. Currency reforms calmed the storm of inflation. Trade resumed cautiously. Cities repaired roads, reopened theatres, and restored bridges that had fallen into disrepair. Families breathed a little more easily. buying bread without fear that prices would quadruple before nightfall. Children played again in parks without sensing the tension that had once filled the air. Yet even as life grew steadier, the echoes of the empire remained. Soft reminders of how quickly the world could change, how deeply history could shape a nation's spirit. These echoes lived in monuments, in old photographs tucked into drawers, in stories told by grandparents beside the hearth. They were not heavy burdens, but gentle murmurs, encouraging reflection without overwhelming the present. Germany's path forward, though still uncertain, was illuminated by the resilience of its people. Their ability to adapt, to care for one another, and to seek harmony even when surrounded by turmoil. And in these quiet strengths lay the foundation for whatever future would come next. But the story of the German Empire was not yet finished. There remained one final chapter, one of memory, legacy, and the gentle traces left behind by an era that had shaped a nation's identity. The echo of the empire was fading, but its lessons lingered, waiting to guide the generations yet to walk these same streets, tend these same fields, and dream beneath these same skies. In the decades that followed the fall of the German Empire, its presence slowly softened into memory, settling gently into the deeper layers of history, like the quiet imprint left on a path after many travelers have passed. The world around Germany transformed in countless ways. New governments rose, borders shifted, generations grew up with new challenges and new hopes. Yet the echoes of the Kaiserreich, distant but persistent, remained woven into the land, the culture, and the quiet stories shared among families across the country. For many, the legacy of the empire lived not in grand monuments or political systems, but in the subtler textures of daily life. It lingered in the architecture of old railway stations, whose iron arches once symbolized unity and progress. It appeared in the red brick facades of schools built during the era, where generations of children learned to read and write beneath tall windows that let in generous morning light. It could be felt in the calm dignity of town halls, constructed under the empire's guidance, their chiming clocks continuing to mark the hours with comforting regularity. Even in the countryside, reminders of the era remained. Farmhouses built during the late 19th century still stood strong, their timber frames seasoned by time, their gardens filled with flowers planted by ancestors whose hands worked the soil with patience and care. Winding roads that once connected villages to expanding rail networks continued to guide travelers through rolling hills and sweet-smelling meadows. Stone bridges, built sturdy and dependable, carried thousands across rivers flowing as quietly as they had in the Kaiser's time. Beyond these physical traces, the legacy also lived in the cultural rhythms that shaped German life. Traditions that strengthened during the empire remained vibrant. Evening walks through town squares, municipal orchestras performing in leafy parks during summer months, and festivals that celebrated regional heritage with music, laughter, and shared meals. The empire had nurtured a pride in craftsmanship, and this pride endured. Bakers continued to perfect breads that filled homes with warmth. Artisans carved wood, shaped clay, and painted landscapes with skill passed down through generations. And though the monarchy itself did not return, the memory of Kaiser Wilhelm I, the gentle elder figure who oversaw unification, and even Wilhelm II, complex and energetic, remained part of the nation's story. Historians wrote about them, communities debated their choices, and students learned their names as markers in the long arc of German development. But these figures moved into a quieter space within the collective memory, their roles softened by time and reflection. They became characters in a larger narrative, one that Germany examined with both honesty and distance. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the empire was the sense of shared identity it had helped cultivate. Before unification, people often identified first as Bavarians, Saxons, Prussians, or Württembergers. The empire did not erase those identities, and they remain cherished today. But it also introduced a larger idea of belonging to something broader, a shared home where many traditions could coexist. Even after the empire ended, this sense of collective identity remained, evolving through the decades as Germany changed, grew, and redefined itself. In modern cities, visitors can still walk along avenues where horse-drawn carriages once travelled beneath gas lamps glowing softly in the night. Electric trams now hum along those same paths, and cafes fill with the gentle murmur of conversation. Students discussing studies, friends sharing stories, and elders reminiscing about their younger days. The world looks different now, yet the atmosphere retains a familiar warmth, as though the past and present share a quiet harmony. The empire's commitment to education also left a lasting imprint. Universities founded or expanded during that time continue to flourish, their halls filled with curiosity and discovery. Students study physics, history, literature, and art with enthusiasm, building knowledge that stretches far beyond what could have been imagined in the early days of unification. Libraries built long ago still hold shelves of books that smell faintly of old paper and wisdom. These institutions, rooted in the Kaiserreich, help carry forward the belief that knowledge enriches not only individuals, but entire societies. Even the idea of social welfare, shaped during Bismarck's years, endured and expanded. Modern systems of social support, healthcare, pensions, accident insurance, can trace some of their earliest foundations to the empire's reforms. These structures continue to offer comfort and security, reflecting the enduring value of caring for communities, especially in times of difficulty. Of course, history moved forward in ways the empire's founders could never have foreseen. Germany experienced periods of hardship, transformation, rebuilding, and remarkable renewal. Wars reshaped borders and societies. Political systems rose and fell. New generations stepped forward to lead the nation with fresh perspectives and aspirations. And through each phase, the legacy of the empire grew quieter, more symbolic, but still present in the background, like a faint echo heard when the world grows still. Today, many travelers wandering through Germany's cities and countryside may feel that echo if they pause and listen. It is there in the soft tolling of church bells in a small village. It is there in the rhythm of trains gliding into stations whose stone arches have witnessed more than a century of change. It is there in the gentle pride with which people speak of their homeland. Its beauty, its resilience, its deep and varied history. The Kaiserreich, though long dissolved, remains a chapter that helped shape the chapters that followed. Its legacy is not one of triumph or tragedy alone, but a blend of ambition, complexity, innovation, hardship, and human spirit. It is a reminder that nations, like people, evolve through seasons, some bright, some difficult, all meaningful in their own way. And as the story of the German Empire settles into its place within the larger tapestry of the world, It invites reflection rather than judgment, understanding rather than haste. It encourages us to appreciate how history grows layer by layer, shaping the present with quiet but persistent influence. Now, as we reach the end of this long, gentle journey through time, imagine standing in a peaceful German meadow at dusk. The sky glows softly with fading light. A river murmurs nearby, steady and calm. The air carries the scent of grass and distant wood smoke. In this moment, the past feels close, not as a weight, but as a whisper, reminding us of the countless lives, hopes, and dreams that have shaped the world we know. And as night settles gently over the landscape, may you feel a sense of ease, a sense of continuity, and a sense of peace. May your rest be calm, your dreams gentle, and your spirit light. Sleep well, and let history keep you company as you drift into the quiet of the night.